Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Betsy Reed. I'm editor-in-chief of The Intercept. And I am honored and thrilled to be bringing you this event tonight. We were overwhelmed with the immediate response to it, and not surprised, given the spectacular lineup and the incredible urgency and timeliness of the topic, but still heartened that there's so much interest out there in it. So The Intercept was founded in part as a platform for reporting on the disclosures of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. These were stories, of course, that shook the world, revealing the extent of government surveillance of our most intimate lives and the terrifying capacity that had developed like under our noses without our knowledge. And it was the insidious alliance of government and industry in constructing the new surveillance state that was one of the most chilling revelations of the Snowden archive. Today, we're still, at The Intercept, we're still obsessed with this sort of steady drip of alarming news about encroachments on privacy. And we have a special focus on the ways the tech giants are winnowing into our private lives while disguising their agenda in this Orwellian fashion, using the benevolent, grandiose language of wanting only to make our lives better. This is an actual quote from one Silicon Valley startup guide. They want to augment the human condition for a huge number of people in a meaningful way. So, we believe it's very vital to report on, the latest news about Facebook or Google and the way they're profiting from their ability to predict our behavior. But we also recognize that it's not enough, and that at a moment like this, we really need to appreciate the magnitude of the changes that are going on around us. We don't want to be like the proverbial frog that is steeped in water, gradually getting warmer and not realizing that it's reached the boiling point. So this is where Shoshana Zuboff comes in. We're here tonight to discuss her, I think it's fair to say, magisterial new work, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power. I'll leave it to Shoshana and Naomi to show you how brilliant and revelatory this book is, but I want to tell you that it's really worth grabbing a copy for yourself if you haven't already, and several friends, because it's not only gorgeously written, but this will actually augment the human condition for a huge number of people in a meaningful way, if you read it. Shoshana is the Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School and the author of the highly influential book, In the Age of the Smart Machine, The Future of Work and Power. Speaking with Shoshana tonight and introducing her is The Intercept's columnist and senior correspondent, Naomi Klein. Naomi is the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair of Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers. Her most recent book is The Battle for Paradise, which was based in part on her reporting for The Intercept about Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. She's also, of course, the author of many best-selling books, including The Shock Doctrine, No Logo, and This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. So Naomi first talked about the idea for this event quite recently, so I'm grateful for everyone at The Intercept that pulled it off to bring it to you tonight, and to the Internet Society, which stepped up to sponsor the live stream and to bring it to hopefully thousands more people. From the moment we began discussing it, I was struck by how perfect it would be to have these two truly great minds in a live dialogue, precisely because of their extremely rare ability to zoom out and see the big patterns that it's so easy to miss, so that we can better understand and resist the forces that are constraining our ability to control our own lives and our future, and the future of this society and the planet. So I'm thrilled that we're about to see them together in action. Over to you, Naomi.
Hi. Hey, everybody. Wow, it's so great to be with you. So good to be with you. Thank you, Betsy, the entire amazing team at The Intercept, and all of you for being here tonight. Here's the plan. Shoshana Zuboff is going to come up here, and she's going to speak for about 20 minutes about the book. Now, as some of you have noticed, and I already met somebody who had the very bright idea of just bringing the cover of the book to get signed. This is not a short book, so Shoshana is barely going to have time to scratch the surface. And by the way, that is not a diss I write door stoppers as well. Sometimes there's a reason. So after that, I'm going to come back on stage and interview Professor Zuboff so that she can go into more depth than she'll be able to do in that short overview. And as I'm asking questions, some of you will undoubtedly be raging at all of the critical questions that I am failing to ask about, and that's good because after we finish up, there's going to be a mic in the aisle, and you will have your chance, and after that, there will also be a chance to have your books or your book covers signed on stage by Professor Zuboff. So, as Betsy said, this is an extraordinary book, and it comes just in the nick of time, while there is still a small window to resist the dangerous trends that it drags into the light. I read The Age of Surveillance Capitalism about 4 months ago, before the official release, because I'm one of the blurbers on the back, and being an early reader was a joy and a privilege. It meant that I had time to think about it, process it, put it on the reading list for my course. But it was incredibly annoying for all of the people I live and work with, because for several months, all I could do was harangue them about how they simply had to read this book in order to have informed conversations about anything. But of course, they couldn't read the book, and I sure as hell wasn't going to lend them my copy. So I know this sounds a tad hyperbolic, but this is the kind of book that has become very rare in our culture, because it is the kind of book that takes time. Time to research, time to think, time to structure, and time to carefully write. And that means time out of the constant chatter that makes up the data flows that are the raw inputs of the new economy that this book so chillingly documents. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism was 7 years in the making and many more years in developing an intellectual framework in which to place that research. So the main thing that I want to stress tonight is that although this is a book about a business model forged by the tech sector, it is not a tech book. It is a book about us, our society, our democracy, our freedoms, our sense of self, and our futures. It would have been enough if Professor Zuboff had simply mapped this new landscape for us and told us how it emerged. And she does both of those things in tremendous depth and with amazing lucidity of thought and prose. But she does more than that. She also wrestles with these thornier philosophical questions of autonomy and selfhood, and what it means for humans to lose access to knowledge about how our world works, the most crucial tool of self-determination. It's a very fortunate thing when a book of this caliber arrives at the precise historical moment when the public is ready to receive it. And I do believe that we are in a moment like that. The signs of a new people's rebellion against the totalizing power of big tech are all around us. More and more people are questioning the impact of social media on their mental health, well-being, labor, and leisure. And since 2006 and the 2016 and the Cambridge Analytica revelations, we are wrestling with what it means for democracy. We see the new mood of resistance inside tech companies and on the streets outside. We see it in a wave of tech worker organizing, from warehouses of Amazon to workers at a very high level organizing to refuse to build the technology of weaponized surveillance. For instance, the technology that would enable companies to work with the Pentagon to improve their targeting of drone strikes. And I think of enormous significance is the fact that this past November, 20,000 Google employees from Singapore to Dublin stunned the world by walking off the job en masse in the Google walkout, which was sparked by sexual harassment but involved many of these other issues around workplace rights and democracy. And it's often not mentioned that in the historic West Virginia teachers' strike, the one that happened last year and inspired this wave of teacher organizing that we're still in the midst of, the issue was not only a lack of funding for public schools, though it was certainly that. Those teachers also went on strike over surveillance capitalism. The fact that they were being told to download an app to their phones that would measure how many steps they took, and that would impact the salaries that they were able to take home. And they drew a line, and they said no. And there are many more examples of people drawing these kinds of lines. But we are gathered here in New York City, the city that dared to stand up to Amazon and say no. No, we will not hand you billions of dollars in tax breaks so that you can further gentrify our city, continue to exploit workers, and collaborate with ICE in its machinery of deportation. And Shoshana and I are going to talk about that fateful decision. Friends, we are in a moment, one that was waiting for its lexicon, waiting for its map, and it has arrived. Please join me in thanking Professor Zuboff for her many years of careful and tenacious labor, and in welcoming her to the stage tonight. Thank you.
Is this on? This is on. Thank you so much. Couldn't be more grateful to see you all out here this evening. Friday night, party night, and you're here with us, so. Well, there's always the after party. Thank you so much for coming. You know, I want to start out by just asking you a question. I want to hear a little bit about what brought you to this event tonight, and then hopefully reflect on that together for just a moment. Then I'm going to shout out some headlines, just some of the top line ideas that come from the book that we'll be able to dig in more detail with Naomi. And then if there's time, I'm hoping to read you a couple of paragraphs from the book that I'm kind of fond of, and I thought I'd really like to share with you tonight. So, let me start out by asking you a question. First of all, I need a scribe. I need a volunteer to be a scribe. Is there anyone who has a pencil and paper handy where they could be a scribe for me? Come on, baby, don't be shy. Oh, perfect, front row and everything. Okay, you are elected. What is your name, sir? David, thank you so much. All right, I'll tell you your task in just a minute, David. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is think about what brought you out here. Hi, everybody up there. What brought you out here tonight? What brought you out here tonight? What concern, what question, what feeling, what brought you out here tonight? And just contemplate that for a moment, and then reduce that to one word. Just want to get that down to one word. And when you've got that word, please shout it out, and David's going to write it down. Okay, here we go. Go ahead. Fear. What? Fear, privacy, intrusion. What came over here? Paranoia. Solidarity. Responsibility. Curiosity. Okay. Wait. Democracy, empowerment, behavior. How are you doing, David? Okay. All right. So, all right. Let's cut David some slack here, will you please? All right. All right. Are you caught up, David? Empowerment, democracy, paranoia, fear. Yep, okay, we're good then. Slavery. Defense.
Free.
What was that?
Free. What is free?
What is free?
Free.
Free.
Collaboration.
Collaboration.
Parasite.
Parasites. Corporatization. Okay, let's let David catch up. Revolution, that's a good one. Tell me when you get to revolution. Wait a minute, tell me when you get to revolution, David. Okay, good. All right. Well, what is that? Understanding. Okay. resistance. All right. I think we're getting the gist. So here's what I want to share with you. These are very important and evocative words, and they bear right down to the center of our lives, don't they? The way I look at it, the titanic struggles of capital in the 20th century bore down on the economic domain. They bore down on our workplaces, and they bore down on us in our economic roles as consumers and as employees, as workers. In our era, in our time, these titanic struggles of capital are not just bearing down on the economic domain. They bear down fully on society, on the social domain, on our bodies, on our everyday lives, in our homes, in our cars, on our streets, in our cities. They are part of the fabric of our everyday life, out of the economic domain into the social domain, bearing down on our very bodies and our lives. They call us users. What does that even mean? Could there be a less meaningful word on earth? They call us users. But here's something I want to tell you. I brought this for you. So I've been in, my book was published a few weeks ago, early January, mid-January. And I've been on the road pretty much all that time. So I've been in 3 countries, 6 cities, and I started asking this question of my audiences pretty early on in all these different locales. Let me tell you what other people said when I asked them this question, other groups. Sovereignty, determinism, fear, resistance, inequality, bias, revolution, dignity, autonomy, democracy, manipulation. Another group, anxiety, manipulation, control, identity, freedom, resistance, power, democracy, law. You hear the echoes? They call us users. And yet here we are across countries, across cities, experiencing so many of the same concerns. I say we are not users. I say we are bound in new psychological, social, political, as well as economic interests. That we have not yet invented the words to describe the ways that we are bound. We have not yet invented the forms of collective action to express the interests that bind us. And that is a big part of the work that must follow in this year and the next year and the year after that, if we are to ultimately interrupt and outlaw what I view as a pernicious rogue capitalism that has no business dominating our society. All right. In the year 1833 in Britain, as the industrial capitalism was just emerging, when they talked about the social hierarchy in Britain, they had 2 terms, the aristocracy and the lower classes. There was no one else. So whether you were a banker or a pauper, a merchant, whatever, you were all part of the lower classes. I submit to you that that is a parallel to the term users. We are just right now in this catch-all of the lower classes. But soon, what will emerge is what emerged a century ago, the idea that there are workers, that there are laborers, that they have interests, and that they will organize around those interests. that there are consumers, and they have interests, and they will act according to their interests. Consumers perpetrated the American Revolution. Laborers fought for enfranchisement and the establishment of real democracy in Britain. These were powerful roles, and we will find our own. What is surveillance capitalism? Surveillance capitalism diverges from the history of capitalism in many, many ways. But here, in this big pattern, it follows the history of capitalism. Let me describe it this way. Throughout capitalism, as historians have observed, throughout its history, capitalism claims things that live outside the market dynamic, and it brings them into the market dynamic so that they can become commodities to be sold and purchased. Everybody understands this, right? Industrial capitalism claimed nature for the market dynamic, that it could be reborn as real estate, as land, to be sold, to be purchased. It claimed work for the market dynamic, that it could be reclaimed as labor, wage labor, to be sold and purchased. Surveillance capitalism follows in this pathway, but with a dark and strange twist. Because now surveillance capitalism went in search of the last virgin wood. And what it found was private human experience. And what it does is to unilaterally claim private human experience for the market dynamic, that it can be reborn as behavioral data. Private human experience claimed as a free source of raw material to be reborn as behavioral data. In the logic of surveillance capitalism, these behavioral data are sent into its production processes, elaborate supply chains that capture these behavioral data from every aspect of our lives and activities, channel these data into new production processes that are called what? Artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, all of that. And out of this black box emerges surveillance capitalism's products. Its products are predictions. I call them prediction products. They are predictions of our behavior, predictions of what we will do now, soon, and later. Turns out many, many businesses have an interest in this knowledge. And these new businesses form a new kind of marketplace that trades exclusively in these predictions. Call them behavioral futures. Now, as everybody knows, this whole logic was born and raised in the context of online targeted advertising. And for a long time we thought, oh, this is online targeted advertising. This is the only way advertising can be in the digital. And we adapted and found ways to live with this idea of targeted ads. But what we really didn't think about was the way in which online targeted advertising represents this sequence that I've just described to you. In this case, what Google learned to do was to predict a piece of future behavior, namely a click-through rate probability. That's a piece of future behavior. And what those advertisers are buying in their ad auctions is essentially they're making bets on these predictions of future behavior. That's how it works. This logic, this economic logic, born in Google, elaborated in Google, becoming successful in Google, only did we learn how successful when Google IPO'd in the year 2004, and we discovered that in 1996, 1996, when its revenues were 86 million. I knew there was an 86 in there. Its revenues were 86 million. Between that year and 2004, when its revenues were $3.2 billion, it actually increased its revenue line by 3,590%. On the strength of these discoveries and this economic logic. So as we begin to understand the economic logic, that's part of the work of my book, as we begin to understand its economic imperatives, what happens is we begin to walk back from the wonderland in which they have put us. And as Alice went through the looking glass into the wonderland, we get to walk backwards through the looking glass, out of the wonderland, into the real world, where we can start to see things clearly without the fog of rhetoric and obfuscation and euphemism, mendacity and misdirection that have become second nature to the propagandists of surveillance capitalism. And as we walk back, we start to see some things. Like, for example, we thought that they were free, that their products and services were free for us. But all the time that we're thinking that they're free, they're thinking that we're free. We're the free raw material. Get them engaged, get them engaged, get them engaged. Keep that data flowing, keep it flowing. Get them engaged anywhere and everywhere, it doesn't matter. Call it a car, call it a house. Call it a digital assistant, call it a thermostat, call it a search engine, it doesn't matter. Call it social media, it doesn't matter. Get them engaged, keep the data flowing, complex supply chains flowing to production. We thought we were using social media, but social media was using us. We thought we were searching Google, but Google was searching us. Thank you. We thought that these companies had privacy policies, but in fact these companies have surveillance policies. And we became all too vulnerable to something that they told us over and over and over again. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. When the fact is, and how many of us have lost our bearings on this, when the fact is that if you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing. Because everything that you are, the place inside you, your inner resources from which you draw your sense of identity, your sense of voice, your sense of autonomy and moral judgment, your ability to think critically, to resist, even to revolt. These are the capabilities that can only be grown within. Jean-Paul Sartre calls it the will to will. And that will to will grows from within, and you should hide it, and you should cherish it, and it should be private, and it should be yours. So they've destabilized our moral bearings and our sense of self. And what we discover when we learn about the economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism is that these imperatives, it's not that there are all bad people in these companies. These imperatives compel these corporations. They compel these corporations to enter a collision course with democracy. A collision course with democracy. And this happens from below and it happens from above. From below, democracy is diminished because ultimately surveillance capitalists discovered in the heat of competition that the most powerful predictive data come from actually influencing our behavior towards its preferred outcomes. We'll talk more about that with Naomi. But just let me give you that top line for now to say that in order to fulfill its own economic imperatives, Surveillance capitalism must undermine human autonomy. It must rob us of decision rights over our own private experience. Is that 15? 5 left? Okay, good to know. So from below, it's eroding autonomy. It's eroding the principles of individual sovereignty because it's eroding our decision rights, our control over our own experience, its boundaries, its inwardness. I call these the right to the future tense and the right to sanctuary. These are being eroded from below, and without these, a flourishing democratic society is impossible. But it also challenges democracy from above, because it means that we enter the 21st century, and all of us are already preoccupied, stressed, worried, being activists, writing, thinking, helping, doing whatever we can to figure out how we move past the pernicious economic inequality that has scarred our societies. But now, surveillance capitalism means that we enter the 21st century with a wholly new axis of social inequality imposed upon us. And this is the inequality of knowledge. Because with these practices that I have just briefly described so far, what we see is under the aegis of private capital, and specifically private surveillance capital. These companies take control of 21st century society, sporting asymmetries of knowledge, unlike anything the world has seen. Asymmetries of knowledge. They know so much about us. We know so little about them. We do not know about us what they know about us. They have so much knowledge that is from us, but that knowledge is not for us. These asymmetries of knowledge produce equally pernicious asymmetries of power, the power that accrues from this knowledge. Specifically, and I hope we get into this discussion with Naomi, specifically the power to command the digital milieu, to command this capitally intensive, ubiquitous digital infrastructure that now saturates our lives, to command that in order to not only know us, track us, monitor us from where we are and where we go, to our posture and our gait and our faces and the muscles that express themselves in our faces and give away our emotions, of finding our personality profiles in the exclamation points and bullet points that we leave in our online posts. But they go beyond that to influence and modify our behavior at the scale of populations. What is this power? This power to actually influence populations, unauthorized, self-regulated, without democracy's oversight, without democracy's participation, without our knowledge. Systems that are specifically engineered to keep us in ignorance. Systems that are specifically engineered and celebrated for their ability to bypass our awareness. Ergo, my friends, surveillance capitalism. It's not a word chosen lightly. It's a word chosen because this capital cannot accumulate without the social relations of the one-way mirror. Because when we know about it, and if we have a choice, they are over. All right. I was going to close with the reading of just a couple of paragraphs. Do you think I still have time for that, Thomas? All right, I'll let you be my guide on that. There are a couple of paragraphs that I wanted to read you, but before I do that, I just want to check and see if it's going to be relevant relevant to all of us. So let me ask you a couple of quick questions. First of all, could you just raise your hand? How many people in the room have children? Okay, thank you. And how many people in the room are under the age of 35? Okay, thank you. So what I'm concluding here is that everybody in the room either has children or is children. So I think I'm going to be okay. I think I'm going to sit down to read to you. And I'm choosing these chapters. By the way, you know, as I'm turning to the last pages of my book, I just thought you might be interested in knowing that despite how fat and heavy it is, it's only 524 pages and one paragraph. Because, look, all of this is endnotes. It's very well researched. 524 pages, that's just a long weekend. All right. I want to read you these pages because I dedicated this book to my children. I'm so proud that my children are here tonight. Chloe and Jake Maxman, love you so much. This book would not exist without you, your inspiration, and your help. And my second son, Kenyon Woodward, who's here tonight, came up from North Carolina to surprise me. I'm so happy that Kenyon's here. I wrote this for my children and for all the children, for all the young people in my children's generation, because you're going to be in the front lines of this like so many other messes that you are inheriting. And I apologize for that. And I wrote this book for you as a way of perhaps making some amends. When I speak to my children or an audience of young people, I try to alert them to the historically contingent nature of the thing that has us. And I do this by calling attention to ordinary values and expectations before surveillance capitalism began its campaign of psychic numbing. It is not okay to have to hide in your own life. It is not normal, I tell them. It is not okay to spend your lunchtime conversations comparing software that will camouflage you and protect you from continuous unwanted invasion. 5 trackers blocked, 4 trackers blocked, 59 trackers blocked, facial features scrambled, voice disguised. I tell them that the word search has meant a daring existential journey, not a finger tap to already existing answers. That friend is an embodied mystery that can only be forged face to face and heart to heart, and that recognition is the glimmer of homecoming we experience in our beloved's face, not facial recognition. I say that it is not okay to have our best instincts for connection, empathy, and information exploited by a draconian quid pro quo that holds these goods hostage to the pervasive strip search of our lives. It is not okay for every move, emotion, utterance, and desire to be cataloged, manipulated, and then used to surreptitiously herd us through the future tense for the sake of someone else's profit. These things are brand new, I tell them. They are unprecedented. You should not take them for granted because they are not okay. If democracy is to be replenished in the coming decades, it is up to us to rekindle the sense of outrage and loss over what has been taken from us. In this, I do not mean only our personal information. What is at stake here is the human expectation of sovereignty over one's own life and authorship over one's own experience. What is at stake is the inward experience from which we form the will to will and the public spaces to act on that will. What is at stake is the dominant principle of social ordering in an information civilization and our rights as individuals and societies to ask the key questions in an information civilization. Who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? These are the questions of knowledge, authority, and power that will determine the nature of our 21st century society and the digital future that waits in store. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Oops, our time machine.
Checking up.
No, timing us. All right.
So well organized, Naomi.
Okay. Well, that was wonderful. That idea of hiding in your own life, I think we should really hold on to. And I think it shows the extent to which this really has colonized the culture, that this is taken for granted, to create multiple accounts online, assuming one is going to be under surveillance from employers decades in the future, and another one that is expressing your real self. To carve yourself up like that at the age of 11. You know? It's extraordinary. So you put surveillance capitalism within this arc of history of capitalism and the history of enclosure. And really starting with the enclosure of the original commons, right, of common land, and the dispossession of the British peasantry. And so as I've been sort of trying to talk about this book, I talk about this as is this the final stage of the enclosure process? First, the enclosure of land and labor, then our lifetime, the neoliberal period, the swallowing of the public sphere, education, libraries, healthcare, the marketization of every aspect of life, and now our most intimate personal interactions, our imaginations, our very selves. Is there a stage after this?
Well, you know, I think a lot about why these guys are so interested in outer space. You know, it's like a disease. You know, let's get another planet, start all over again. So I say that with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but not entirely. You know, there are new frontiers being anticipated, and when it comes to our private experience as the Virgin Wood, I'm hoping that it is the case. You know, I say in the very end of the book, the Gilded Age, for all of its destructiveness and violence, it was ended. It was, in the larger scheme of things, a relatively short age, and so may the age of surveillance capitalism be a short age as we begin to activate the measures, activate the resources of our democratic institutions, activate the competitive solutions that will enable us to interrupt and outlaw the most pernicious aspects of surveillance capitalism. So there will have to be other frontiers, and I'm sure they will find them. But the other possibility here, Naomi, that perhaps is relevant, I'll just mention it, and you decide if you want to dig deeper, is that, you know, I still believe that there are competitive solutions. you know that I believe that democracy is the first stop here. That we've got to double down on democracy if we're going to get over and around surveillance capitalism. But in doing that, we're opening space for competitive solutions.
Solutions within capitalism.
Solutions within capitalism that not all capitalism, is based on illegitimate dispossession in this way, in the sense that we can imagine a form of information capitalism that actually carefully builds a new kind of institution that is aligned with democratic principles, that is subjected to democratic oversight, that is aligned with the true needs of populations and is for us, not just about us. And therefore, I can imagine the founding of alternative ecosystems where there still is a role for commerce in the connected sphere, not the entire connected sphere owned and operated by private capital, but there is a role, and that could be a far more healthy role, one that actually serves us in a positive way.
Well, that gets pretty quickly into a deep debate about capitalism that I wasn't planning to get into this early in the conversation, because I'm not so sure I agree that, but there are a few pieces of that I do want to pry apart, because, I can certainly imagine ways of interacting with technology that are both profitable for corporations and are not based on surveillance capitalism, right? I would argue that they're extractive in other ways. If we're talking about like Apple as an example of a company that
Absolutely.
doesn't, that. So, but more broadly, right? Absolutely, there are ways that we could ban certain practices, and I think we definitely want to get into that more deeply of what the kind of democratic solutions are to this. But all of this ultimately is about resolving a crisis within capitalism, the crisis of growth. And every one of these stages of enclosure that we've been talking about were always about trying to resolve a crisis within capitalism of stagnation and the built-in need within capitalism to have these bubbles. Now, surveillance capitalism is the new bubble, right? Data is the new bubble. All of this behavioral data is the new bubble. But one of the most interesting parts of your book to me, all of it was interesting, but was your narrative of how this was born in crisis, right? This twin crisis of the dot-com bubble bursting and there needing to be a business model, right? And all of these surveillance capitalism companies, they never had a business model within capitalism, right? They offered a free product, got a ton of quote-unquote users, and then figured out how to mine the data, right? But they were fictitious companies before they figured out how to do it, or at least not sustainable by the market's own terms, right? So I would love just for you to talk more about the role of crisis in the birth of surveillance capitalism, the dot-com bubble bursting, and 9/11, these twin crises, and how that produced this moment.
Well, you're absolutely right. The shock doctrine was put to good use in the birth of surveillance capitalism in a couple of ways. First of all, some of you may know that the Google founders were very explicit early on about their antipathy toward advertising. They thought online advertising would not only disfigure the internet, but it would destroy the integrity of their search engine. There were about 7 people in the early Google that were dedicated to the advertising function, and even those 7 people hated advertising, or at least most of them were on record as being embarrassed about advertising. Then came the shock, the dot-com bubble bursting, and of course, that was pandemonium in Silicon Valley. Smart companies that had incredible products and services, but that weren't yet capitalists because they hadn't figured out how to make money. So in the heat of emergency, under the pressure of financial emergency, excuse me, and its own venture capitalists threatening to pull out support, the founders of Google did a volte-face. They decided that we've got to save the company at any price. They had their personal motivations for doing so. And the idea here was, in the heat of emergency, they decided to use data that had been left over, collateral behavioral data produced while people searched and browsed and so forth, sitting in logs, not used, called waste, called data exhaust, and all those kinds of terms. And they decided, people had been fooling around with some of those data logs, discovered that there was predictive value in those data. So in this emergency, that's when they decided to pull those data. Now, mind you, the users who provided those data didn't know that they had done that, didn't know that there was predictive behavioral data about them sitting around someplace. They decided to use these data to combine them with their already, even in the years 2000, 2001, you know, they were already at the frontier of computational capabilities in Silicon Valley and indeed in, you know, basically on planet Earth. So don't forget, they'd come up through the computer science department at Stanford and, you know, they were brilliant. So out of this black box of the data and the computation, they were able to produce a new kind of prediction, as I mentioned earlier, that they could sell to advertisers. And so instead of advertisers choosing where they put their ads, now advertisers would just, you know, buy the thing that the machine spit out. And Google said, you know, we're not going to tell you how we got that answer, but if you just accept the answer, you will make a lot of money. And as I told you the numbers before, they did make a lot of money. So there's one part of the shock that actually opened the door to the discovery and elaboration and institutionalization of this new economic logic.
And waiving the rules, because they had to. They were
They-
fighting
they-
for their life.
They suspended their own principles in order to accomplish this because it was survival. The other shock that I think you're referring to is the whole war on terror that became part of the historical context in which this new model was born. So obviously, well, surveillance capitalism invented essentially in 2001, the same year as the tragedies of 9/11. We know from the record that literally even on September 10th, I mean, this was a period where the FTC had already decided that the online companies, these new internet companies, were not going to be able to successfully self-regulate. They were already, the FTC was already fighting the whole cookies phenomenon, when cookies were still something to be fighting over. Probably some people in this room weren't even born then, you know, but cookies were outrageous. And then there were things called web bugs, which were little digi things that were sort of buried in a page and also tracked you. And there were these amazing, you know, cybersecurity people back in the late 90s who were writing incredible things about web bugs, just the kind of thing that, you know, I find myself writing about today. So the FTC was already onto this, and they believed that we were going to have comprehensive privacy legislation in this country. And some drafts on this and proposals for this were already circulating in Congress on September 10th, and that was the big conversation when it came to the internet. September 11th, everything changed. And the people who were there on site, you know, talk about it changed in hours, changed in 24 hours. And now the preoccupation was total information awareness. And for total information awareness, as we know, you need surveillance. And even though, you know, these new inventions, the economic logic that I call surveillance capitalism, wasn't yet public. So it's not like the folks in Washington actually already knew, you know, what Google was about to become. But what they did know was that they were getting data from people. And they did know that they were really smart and they had computers and they knew how to do things with those data that others didn't yet know how to do. And so there was a sense that one can track and trace, and I do believe that there is much more here under the hood for historians to discover, that these stories have not all been excavated, these stories have not yet all been told. But we can see enough to know that there was an effort to kind of incubate and nurture Google and some of the other fledgling companies, efforts coming from the Defense Department and from the intelligence agencies, and even, NSA documents that were all about, Google, hero worship of Google, and asking, how do we become more like Google? So I call this whole complex surveillance exceptionalism. The idea that we're gonna, the idea of redlining, but here is like the positive redlining. We're gonna redline these companies and protect them, buffer them from law, buffer them from impediment, nurture them as we can, and also we're gonna do a lot of house parties together. Everybody knows about the revolving door between especially Google and the Obama administration, the Obama White House, but more in general between Silicon Valley and Washington. So those staff people were just going back and forth with jobs, and jobs in one, jobs in the other. And also they made themselves, the Silicon Valley folks, starting with Google, made themselves essential intellectual politics. They developed Obama's 2008 campaign. They made the difference that made the difference.
Yeah, definitely pay attention to this in the electoral cycle of who's getting these flows.
Yeah, who's getting these flows?
But it is interesting. I mean, it's so striking that there was this moment where they might have acted as regulators, as they might have lived up to their responsibility to protect people's privacy, and then they see themselves actually as partners in this project. And I mean, that's the piece of it that's, I think, particularly scary, is that it's not sort of, are we more scared of surveillance by the state, or are we more scared of corporate surveillance, when really it is this nexus that, where it was born in this nexus, and in some countries the nexus is very clear, like China and India, where it's totally integrated, the state surveillance and corporate surveillance. It's the same machine. I think it shows maybe the stakes of this. But the flip side of it that's so weird is this narrative out there of, the politicians are just so clueless and they're just so old, they could never regulate Facebook. And that spectacle on Capitol Hill of Mark Zuckerberg going there and basically, being asked by senators for help with their AOL, right? It was such a gift to Facebook, because it reinforced this narrative of, you're just too complicated, too far ahead of politics to ever be regulated, right? But then how do we mesh that with our understanding that actually they've been in bed together the entire time?
And let's keep in mind what the real bedrock utilities were here in this relationship. The utilities were, if you're developing these in this country, you're developing these capabilities in the private sector, you are not limited by the United States Constitution. You're developing these capabilities in the private sector, you're not limited by law in the same way that even ultimately the intelligence agencies are accountable to law. It may take us a while, but ultimately they are accountable. So this was the perfect solution in our society to allow these capabilities to flourish in a place where they didn't have to answer to the Constitution, and therefore to have all of those data there, all of those surveillance capabilities, so that when we really need them in Washington, we just take that big straw, and we dip in. So it's like we're harboring all the stuff there, and when we need it, it's there for us. And of course, we learned that with Snowden. We learned that about the PRISM project, that's exactly what they were doing, this kind of symbiosis.
Now, you've used this phrase a couple times tonight, that we are the virgin wood, and this historical analogy with colonialism. And in the book, you go deeper into it, and I would just ask you to talk about the requerimientos and the parallel with today, because I think it's so interesting.
Okay. Well, I do write about, I write about the phenomenon of the unprecedented. The unprecedented. When you really encounter something that is unprecedented in your experience, it is almost impossible to recognize it. It's like you can't actually see it. Because when you encounter something unprecedented, you're looking for things out of your experience, things that are already familiar to you, as a way of grasping, of taking in what you're actually seeing. So, for example, the whole idea of the horseless carriage, right? So you've got an automobile, which is a wholly new thing, quite unprecedented, and for a long time people called it a horseless carriage, rubricizing it, to stuff that was familiar. That's how the unprecedented works. So I try to think about the unprecedented a lot, and I've spent a good part of my life in South America, and I'm just countries that are very dear to my heart, and I think a lot about the first indigenous peoples and what was their encounter with the first Spaniards that they ever saw. And there are accounts where they see these ships and they think that there are mountains riding on the seas. And then these strange men with their hair and their beards and their brocades and their armors, and they think there's some kind of gods coming down from these mountains that somehow ride on the sea. So this shock of the unprecedented. And obviously, the interaction of the Spanish conquistadores and their impact on the indigenous peoples, this is the most painful history to read, a history of death and destruction, of murder, of just unimaginable cruelty. And so I honor that, I recognize that. But there are some strange things about the sort of niceties of the conquistadores that fascinated me. For example, back in the court of Isabel and Ferdinand, they decided that, we're going to take these people's lands and their gold and everything else, their lives and their labor, but we want to do it legally. It would be nice to do it legally.
There should be some kind of piece
It
of
should
paper.
be legal. Let's make it legal. So they needed a way to make it legal. So the monarchs put their head together with the Pope and their lawyers, and they came up with something called the requerimiento, which is an edict written in Castilian Spanish of the 15th century, and intended to be read to the villagers. And it goes on in legalese. In the name of the Queen and the King and the Pope, we take you and your lands and so forth. And then it goes all around, and then at the very end, it basically says, and if you don't agree, then we have the right to burn and pillage and rob and steal and kill and maim and all the things that they indeed did do.
And it's a language that is not understood by the people they're presenting.
So they come to the village and they pull out the edict and they read it in Castilian Spanish to indigenous peoples who think that they're looking at some kind of strange gods that have emerged from somewhere across the horizon, who have no idea, of course, what they're saying. And the one monk who bears witness to these things, Bartolome, he says that he never saw any translator there, any effort to translate. Is this reminding you of anything? Because it should be. Every time you click that little box, I agree. And they say, well, they agreed to it. And you hear Eric Schmidt with that little that little mantra, and we will take and know everything about you with your permission. And we will take your life and know everything about you and about your friends and about where you're coming and where you're going, with your permission, of course. And permission is that little tick. And that little tick, what are we ticking on? We're ticking on the 21st century version of the requerimiento, the legal edict that we cannot understand, written in a language designed to keep us ignorant, along with so many other things about their practices.
I mean, it certainly makes you think a little harder on move fast and break things, you know? And this whole model of getting
Move fast and break things was an accident that he ever said it, because it was one of the few times that he told the truth. And we just thought he was being cute.
Well, so, another part of the book that I found really fascinating in terms of this kind of very colonial facts on the ground strategy of outrunning any kind of accountability, just moving so quickly that it's in place and then you have to undo if you're going to respond to it, is the story of Street View or Google Earth or whatever it's called.
Okay.
Because it just seems so deliberate. But I'm living here now, but I'm from Toronto, so I need you to talk about sidewalk labs as the ultimate facts on the ground strategy as well.
Okay. All right, we got a lot of work to do. All right, let's see if I can talk fast. What Naomi is referring to is I spent many years just reading about every time, especially Google, but also Facebook, you know, they did something and everybody got outraged. You know, like everybody got outraged about Cambridge Analytica, and for a long time now we've been focused on Facebook, and there are many scandals erupting from Facebook literally, seems like almost every hour these days, but you know, certainly almost every day, and definitely almost every week. I brought some with me just to show you if we got bored. But so what I noticed is that there is a cycle here that they have perfected. The first part of the cycle is the incursion. So this is the conquistadores, they're just coming in, no one's going to stop them because no one even has a clue what they're doing, let alone what kind of destruction is going to be down the road. So they're just marching in. I call this first phase incursion. All right, and then ultimately somebody is going to say something, somebody is going to push back, right? So this happened a couple weeks ago, maybe some of you read about it. Somebody blew the lid off the fact that the Nest makes smart home devices. Nest is owned by Google. Nest's security system, it was discovered, I think on February 5th, maybe a little bit later. It has a microphone buried in it. Oops. And what did Google say? Oh, oops. We meant to tell you that. We forgot to tell you. Yeah, there's a microphone in it. We thought maybe that would come in handy later when you want to use Google Home to tell us everything. So here's a security system that's supposed to keep the burglars out.
Take your hammers to your nest later, by the way.
What'd you say?
Hammers to your nest.
Hammers to your nest, yeah. So the security system is supposed to keep the burglars out. Actually, the burglars are the security system. So now you see these phases kicking in, right? Because first they just took it. That was incursion. They put the microphone there. They didn't care. They weren't asking permission. Okay, now we find out about it. So now it's like all the flim-flam. Oh, gee, yeah, we meant to tell you. Oh, gosh, yeah, we forgot to put it in the schematics. Oh, sorry about that. This will go back and forth. There will be lawsuits. It will go back and forth. This is called the habituation stage of dispossession, because they want this to last as long as possible, this next stage, because eventually it goes on for a few years, and then we forget why we were so upset about it in the first place. What was it that bothered us about that microphone? And then Then finally, some lawsuits, come to fruition and so forth. Then they agree to make adaptations. So now we're in the adaptation stage. And so they change the name, they change something. And then, of course, the next stage, you can probably guess what the next stage is. Redirection. Turns out that adaptation was good for about 32 seconds. Because sometimes the very next day, like when they had to shut down Google Buzz, because all of the outrage over making all the social relationships public without anybody's consent, they shut down Google Buzz, and literally the next day the New York Times announced Google Plus. And then as the forensic people started getting into Google Plus, they discovered that they had switched it over so quickly from Buzz that some of the text and some of the URLs hadn't even been changed in the background material. All right, Street View was one of these par excellence that drove through these stages. Street View, they're driving around in the little cars to map everything. Why are they going to map everything? They're going to map everything because they know that pretty soon getting our data from the online milieu is not going to be enough. They needed data at scale. They needed volumes of data to feed those machines for good predictions. But ultimately, as the competitive dynamic intensified, they understood that they also need varied data, varieties of data, not only scale, but also scope. And this meant driving us out of the online environment into the world, into the real world with our phones. And it was going to mean driving us through the streets, into our homes, in our cars. They needed the maps. They needed to map the real world so that they could help us navigate through it in a way that would profit them. So Street View. And it was in the city of Hamburg in Germany that the data protection supervisor there discovered that these little Street View cars, cute little cars, were actually scraping the family's private data off of its Wi-Fi system and bundling it into the so-called Street View data that it was collecting. Outrage, 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 outrage in Germany, outrage all over the world, hundreds of lawsuits. Ultimately, they dealt with habituation, they dealt with adaptation, and in the end, nothing changed. In the end, Street View continued. Street View mapped the world. Street View mapped our cities and our parks and everywhere else. And then they had another thing where they outfitted people with backpacks so that you could climb a mountain, go down into the valley, go into the Grand Canyon. That's where Canyon loves to go. Go into the Grand Canyon, and you map everything for Google with this backpack. And then you go into the inside of buildings, like these big buildings in New York, the malls and the food courts, all the interiors of the buildings getting mapped as well. It all continued, many new names, many new products, unabated. So can I tell about Pokemon Go and then go to Toronto?
You know what? I actually think we should hold off on that.
Okay.
We only have a few more minutes before
All right.
we open it up. And I think people want to hear whether you feel like New York dodged a bullet on Amazon. Because we're here, and there's been a lot of recrimination about it since. Originally there was sort of a feeling that it was a people's victory. After the fact, it was sort of like, well, you drove away all these good jobs, and then there's a real debate about whether it would have been possible to drive a good deal, a better deal with Amazon. What's your take on this?
I don't want to say New York dodged a bullet. I want to say New York is the bullet. I see what happened in New York in a longer arc. To me, I'm sure that the arc has antecedents before what I'm going to mention as its point of origin, but this is something that I take as very important. It was a moment, which I guess was around, what was it, maybe 2011, when a group of Spanish citizens came to their data protection authorities and said that we want these data about us to be erased from the internet. And there's no one to call. There's no customer service number. That's a whole other issue. For many years on the landing page for my name, where they put that bio box, which, by the way, I find offensive, I was there listed as the author of a novel called Watermelon Nights. And the author of the novel, Watermelon Nights, was listed as the author of a book that I wrote that I'm very fond of, called The Support Economy, Why Corporations Are Failing You in the Next Episode of Capitalism. And there's a link, and you're supposed to write on the link, you know, when there's a mistake. And I must have done that, I don't know, 5,000 times?
Is this really what motivated you to write this book? Is this? I mean, it would really piss me off.
It was that, and the day I asked a group of Google executives how I could opt out of Google Earth.
Well,
I didn't get a very good response.
Well, we really do. We're kind of out of time, but I don't want to open it up before we talk a little bit about where this resistance, which we feel, which is beginning, where it goes, and. You know, whether or not we have differences on the role of markets, what the business models might be, I think that there's clearly a role for the public. There's clearly a role for some kind of assertion of a commons around this. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on tools of resistance and also that sort of mix between markets and you know, one of the things that I think is interesting about these businesses that didn't have a business model is that, in a way, they habituated us not just to this loss of privacy that you've described, which they have habituated us to, but they also habituated us to the idea that we have a right to connection, information, without it being a commodity, right? I mean, that was the whole, that's what social media has done. That's what Google did with search. And is there a model on which these are treated as utilities, or some kind of cooperative ownership? I mean, we're giving them free content. Every Twitter user, every Facebook user is actually a producer. So are there other ownership models that we should be thinking about?
Absolutely. And all I was going to say before, and I'll just say it very, very quickly, is there is an arc of resistance, an arc in which where, you know, the whole idea that I first heard about in the context of the fossil fuel divestment movement, the idea of withdrawing social sanction from industries and institutions. And the idea now is about withdrawing social sanction from surveillance capitalism. And this idea, I think, began to really be forcefully articulated in Spain with these citizens who demanded the right to be forgotten. And ultimately, it was the European High Court that decided that the right to be forgotten should be law. And I saw this and I understand this as the beginning of democracy clawing back what surveillance capitalism took in a way that could not simply be redirected, that it could no longer be theirs, it had to be ours. It came back to democracy's domain and out of private surveillance capital's domain. And so this is an arc, I believe, that has been gathering steam, that has been gathering people and ideas and intellectual energy and political energy and feeling, and the kind of feeling that you brought here tonight is all part of this arc. And so what happened in New York and the contest over Amazon was not only about, I mean, it was about taxes, and it was about housing, and it was about all those immediate issues, but it was also about no longer accepting that anything goes, that all public sacrifices are worthwhile sacrifices for a private actor over which democracy has no control and over which we have no say. So that New York has placed itself in that long arc is, to me, something that makes me very proud. As far as resistance, don't get me wrong, Naomi, I see the whole what is to be done as a three-part answer. The first is the sea change in our awareness that is required. That we can no longer allow ourselves to be ignorant at their hands. And as we begin to name and understand what is happening to us, a lot of this began with, Chris Wiley, who blew the whistle at Cambridge Analytica and opened up a lot to our view that we did not comprehend before. And all he was describing was the everyday, routine, ho-hum, please pass the salt operations of a good, responsible surveillance capitalist, slightly pivoted from commercial to political outcomes. That's what Cambridge Analytica was. And as we began to see the havoc that they were able to wreak with these methods, I think we've developed a better appreciation of what these folks are doing in the commercial realm and the power that is accruing to them. So it begins with a sea change as we name. Naming is essential to taming. My expectation is that with this sea change in our consciousness, we will be pressuring and triggering and mobilizing our political systems, the resources of our democracies that must be called to action. We already see that now in the UK. I'm sure many of you know a UK Parliamentary Committee issued just last week a 108-page report that begins with accusing Facebook of behaving as a digital gangster. Okay, when I wrote my book, the legal people went through it and they made me take out the word theft.
Wow. Wow.
Right, and that was a couple years ago. And they went through. So, digital gangsters, those are big words for a parliamentary committee. That's part of the sea change. All right, we need that here. Now, right now, here is depressing, but that's not going to last forever. We're getting over that. We're going to get past that. These things go in cycles. So this is not the work of a day or a month or a year. This is the work of the next decade, and I have every confidence that we will do this work. Number two, I opened up on the subject of collective action. And this is where other forms of ownership. So a century ago, it was our economic roles that forced us to discover trade unions and collective bargaining and the right to strike, the forms of collective action that we brought to bear to rein in the imbalance of power, to create a kind of equilibrium, however imperfect. I'm not an apologist for capitalism. I do not believe it is perfect, but I do believe that there is an imperfect equilibrium that we call market democracy that can serve society well. And when we look through history and we look around the world for examples that have served us well, that this stands out as one of them. So I believe in that possibility, but it has to be democracy tethering the raw excesses of capitalism to the needs of people and society. Anyway, I believe that we will discover the new forms of relevant collective action, and we're already seeing this around the world. I've just been in Brussels, where I spent time with Francesca Bria, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Barcelona. I'm sure some people in this room know what's going on in Barcelona, where they're trying to do the smart city in the way that we own it, that it's our data, our lives, and our city, that the smart city is a democratic municipality. It is the citizen city. And so yes, data collectives and data commons and new forms of solidarity that keep data at the center of the public governmental accountability and responsibility as a public good overseen by democracy with citizen participation. So, you know, that work, I believe, is a frontline crucible for what some of these new forms will be. And finally, there will be a role for commerce in the connected sphere. I mean, I don't see that going away. What I do see going away is that the whole thing is owned and operated by surveillance capital. That you can't get your children's grades from the school without marching through surveillance capital's supply chains. That you can't get your health data without marching through its supply chains. That you can't plan dinner with your family and friends without marching through its supply chains. This is intolerable. This is illegitimate. This is unacceptable. This is a draconian quid pro quo that we should not be forced to make as 21st century citizens. We can easily imagine the digital without surveillance capitalism. And back in that window, in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, when we expected, we ran to the digital. We ran to Wonderland because of its emancipatory potential, democratizing knowledge, empowering us, helping us to solve problems in our lives that, you know, we're too harried and burdened and busy and everybody's working and our kids and school and we need help. We ran to the digital for help and it was giving us help until surveillance capitalism and economic logic, not the digital, not technology, not inevitable. It was an economic logic that came and infected and hijacked the digital for its own purpose. And one last sentence, he's laughing at me. The big lie is that this is the only way the digital can work. This is not technology, this is not inevitable, it's an economic logic. We've stopped economic logics before, we've stopped capitalism before, we can do it again.
Thank you. Okay, is there a mic? Where's the mic?
The mic's going to be in the aisle.
Okay, great. The mic is coming to the aisle. Oh. So polite. There's one mic. There's one mic. It's over here. Sorry, the folks up in the balcony. It's not fair to you. And by the way, hi to all the folks on live stream. I think we've had. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. A shy crowd. All right, we've got our first question.
It's more a correction. I don't know if you read today's Times. Cuomo is trying to get Amazon back, and Jeff Bezos actually took his phone call. The one state senator, I think, who was put on a committee that could have stopped it, has been taken off that committee. So if Amazon does come to Queens, I think the fact that originally they were stopped was a first battle and not the end of the war.
Not the war.
Okay, thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Dele Atanda. I'm from a company called Meta and an internet foundation. We've been working to try and create tools to give people sovereignty control of their data for many years. I wanted to ask you about surveillance capitalism versus the surveillance industrial complex. And what I want to understand is the challenge that I find with surveillance capitalism and this economic logic that you refer to that is touted as the only way forward assumes that the why behind all of this is fundamentally economic. Whereas when you look at the surveillance industrial complex, there are issues around the industrialization of surveillance. And, you know, Naomi made this point earlier about China. You look at China, for example, which effectively isn't a capitalist structure now. I know, of course, that it's still all ruled by money in many senses. But the question that I'm trying to get to is that when you look at industrialization and you look at colonialism and centralization, the fundamentals about this really is about control, and really about the why at the end of this is really about controlling the masses. So my question is, when you look at surveillance capitalism versus industrial complex, do we miss the grand purpose of this in terms of social control as opposed to simply economic progress? Does that make sense?
Well, this is a really long line.
It is.
Oh boy.
You know, it is a long line. How do you feel about grouping a couple questions?
All right, or I could just try to answer them really quickly.
Yeah. It's going to have to be speed round.
Like this is a heavy, big question, and it's so hard to answer really quickly. I apologize in advance, but I guess bottom line is surveillance. The way I write about surveillance capitalism is it begins in the economic domain as a mode of accumulation, not to make us all prosperous, but to create prosperity among surveillance capitalists and with their business customers in these new behavioral futures markets. That's where the revenue is being generated. Then you get the surveillance industrial complex, all the vast machinery and facial recognition, all the capabilities that are being developed and sold in Shenzhen and the town in the city in China that's a famous hub for these devices and technologies. And in China, what you see is an authoritarian state now looking at what was its so-called private sector, its so-called private internet companies, seeing all the capabilities, just like we have here, that they have developed, and realizing that this is too good to let it be private. We're going to annex that to our ambitions, and kind of in the spirit of Cambridge Analytica, be able to do all the things that the surveillance capitalists can do, but do them to fulfill social and political outcomes rather than the commercial outcomes that surveillance capitalists are after. So these are two different trajectories right now.
But in China, they're entirely compatible trajectories. I mean, they also want, obedient consumers and laborers.
Yes, but I'm just saying that in China we see this apotheosis of the authoritarian state annexing what I call the instrumentarian power produced by surveillance capitalism, the power to modify population behavior at scale, annexing that for its social and political goals, how they want people to behave. Whereas, right now, in our milieu, this is still a private action toward maximizing our behavior for commercial ends, not our prosperity, but theirs. So how do we, interrupt and outlaw this before we ever get to a stage where we might enter that zone of the apotheosis, of this fusion of state and private power around these capabilities, which really is, to me, the nightmare scenario.
Okay, so I'm going to really ask for everybody's cooperation. Pithy questions and happiness with short, snappy answers.
Okay, I'll do my best there.
Well, first of all, thank you for facilitating this discussion. I think we're all thinking it, and maybe Facebook knows that, but it's nice to be somewhere else and talk about it. So my question is, I guess originally the net was about a decentralized network spread across the world, and that was going to bring us together. And now we have the TriNet, which is Facebook, Amazon, Google. And so we have these masses of centralized power, which everything passes through. So how do we move past that?
Okay, well, it's short.
Is that too big as well?
I mean, it's kind of the subject of the evening, so why don't you percolate on that, and
So
Well, I'm gonna answer it with one word. I'm gonna change my whole MO and answer it with one word. Is that okay? Democracy.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Yes. So we need to get involved. All right.
Hi, thanks also for bringing this on for us. It's a fantastic talk. Quick question. We've been talking about Facebook and Amazon as well. Specifically, what I wanted to ask about is Amazon Web Services. I'm sure, as you know, they host a lot of the most popular services like Netflix, so your information goes through them. And now, not only do they host CIA infrastructure, so like a literal fusion of those two, but they also, excuse me, sorry, I'm blanking on this. Not only do they host the CIA's computers, but the very size of Amazon now has allowed Jeff Bezos to acquire the Washington Post. And that kind of relationship between both private and state power, and then how that influences supposedly private media, and then in their responsibility to democracy. Just wanted to know your thoughts on that. And I know it's a little big.
Yeah, I would say that there's that this is a very important issue that you're raising, that there's much more analysis that needs to be done on it, that has been done on it, and this gets to the point I was making earlier of how we're entering the 21st century with this disfigured institutional landscape, these huge asymmetries of knowledge, information, data, information, knowledge, all of that in ways that are under the private control of surveillance capital. And this is not the way we want to move through the 21st century toward a democratic future and the kind of digital future that we all hope for. So this is like one example of this larger problem. Can I say that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So how much time, seriously? Okay, well, I mean, a lot of people have books they want to have signed, so we are supposed to wrap in like 5 minutes, which is a little bit hard, but let's just really try to keep it short. We'll do as much as we can.
We'll get to as many as we can.
So I just wanted to ask about this particular strain of capitalism and how it seems that it's a little bit immune to market dynamics, actually. And so it doesn't matter to a lot of these companies to actually make money. These companies, Amazon doesn't actually make a lot of profits. That's why they don't pay taxes. Uber doesn't make money. Snapchat, the CEO said, I don't have any plans to make money, and I don't care about that. So what do you think is going on there, and how do you defeat something like that?
Well, it's not true that they're not making money. Amazon.
Profits.
Okay, profits. It's not even true that they're not making profits. It took Amazon ramped up very slowly. Jeff Bezos had a very clear strategy. Eventually, they did get to profitability, and it took a long time, and he did it the way that he wanted to do it, very carefully institutionalizing certain kinds of systems. But I think the larger question here is, what you said, like they became so dominant. How do you really fight them when they become so dominant? It seems like they don't even have any competitors, really, despite Tim Cook saying, we want to be different. And the thing is, what they did, when I told you about that Google invention story, what they did was, instead of figuring out through careful institutionalization how they were going to make money, and actually Amazon did begin its life as a cunning and ruthless capitalist, but not necessarily a surveillance capitalist, right? And he was building an institution in a very deliberate way. But in the case of Google and Facebook, really, they found the sort of straight line as the crow flies to maximum monetization, and that became the standard. So most startups and apps and all the stuff that's happening in the tech sector emulated them or somehow found a niche in that ecosystem, because that was the standard for generating revenues and ultimately margins and ultimately market capitalization. So so the whole thing is like, how do you pull it back from that to actually now begin to build the kinds of businesses that use the digital in the way we always imagined it would be used, for us, to empower us, and not to scrape from us and sell the results to somebody else. So, I think this is a new part of the work now, to, pull ourselves away from the addiction to these kinds of revenues into something that's more real and sustainable and really moves the dial of economic history. Thank you.
You mentioned that this is not the only way for tech to be. My question is this the only way for capitalist tech to be? Or in other words, is the root cause of surveillance capitalism just capitalism?
Ooh. I hear that, like, ooh. I mean, I don't believe so, and that that may be a controversial point with some folks. I'm not a Pollyanna about capitalism, but I do believe that there is evidence that we can do capitalism constrained by law, capitalism within the frameworks of good regulation, that make sure it doesn't go off the rails in some of these ways that we've been discussing into territories that are illegitimate, and that there's opportunities for companies to even truly with our permission, to gather behavioral data that will improve our lives under our control, under our authority, and under the aegis of our own power and our own collectivities. So I do believe that's possible, and many of those plans were underway in the late 90s and the early 2000s, before this straight line to big revenue time, was cut. And it changed the game for everybody. So there was no longer time to really develop these other pathways in a more scrupulous way that was actually tied to society and tied to our real needs. So I do believe that there is room there.
I'm about to be very unpopular. You are the last question.
Thank you. Free press.
Oh.
Sorry.
No, but you can get your book signed and talk to her then.
Uh-oh, I'm going to get my pajamas for tonight.
Free Press just released a report, I'm sure you're aware, and you're cited in it with the new book. And the proposal that they're talking about is creating a tax on surveillance capitalists, essentially on targeted ad revenue, and using that revenue to fund public journalism. So I would love your thoughts on that and whether it's politically viable at this time.
Okay, well, I've got all those pages of endnotes there, so I'm not a hip shooter, and so this is something that I would love to study and get back to you on. But in general, this is exactly the kind of stuff that we have to be thinking about. Because one way that we're going to improve the chances of our democracy is to reinstate the fourth estate. And the fact that surveillance capitalism has been able to essentially overtake the fourth estate and fit it into a little box in a news feed on your Facebook pages is one of the great crimes of our time. So I'm really in favor of the innovations that we will come up with as societies to claw back that territory and reestablish the necessary work of the fourth estate for its accountability for the words that it publishes. Something that we have lost, and that has been a catastrophic loss for our democracies.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Apologies again to everybody who was in line, but thank you so much, Shoshana,
Thank
for
you,
that
Naomi.
amazing night. And all of you for being here, and the Intercept for hosting us.